So many buttons in this program, man.
I know. We gotta get Steve on this thing.
Yeah, that's they're lucky that it's just like so good performance wise.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which is
It
the only
just
thing I
makes
care
up for
about. The
everything
rest of
else,
it,
which is
maybe not optimal, but you know what? We just streamed for 10 straight hours without any
yeah,
chat. So
yeah. It definitely is like pretty bulletproof in that regard.
yeah, which is the main regard. But I agree. I don't it's like it has all these buttons and I use absolutely none of them except for like
Yeah.
but all right, man. You ready to go?
I guess. I mean, is everyone watching us right now? Or are we on
Yeah.
secret mode? Oh,
No, we're
cool.
live.
Live at Laracon. Woo!
Woo! This is what I just talked about. We need like a representation in the audience. Like I gotta think about this for next year. Like we just need a
Yeah.
live stream of something.
You
Like
need at least like a soundboard or something where you can.
something. Yeah, soundboard. But it might be distracting for you guys speaking. That's why I was like maybe we could take one of the big in-person meetups and like have them with a camera and they could just be one on here in the video or something. So at least there's like
Cool.
30 or 40 people like that you can see live or something.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Right.
that's for next year.
Let me just make sure I'm kind of
Ready? We are a little
ready
ahead
to
of
go.
here, but it's the last one, so I figured it's okay. But if you're not ready, I can
I'm always ready.
stretch and stretch.
Uh,
Everybody make sure to get on laracon.net, check the digital swag. These guys book refactoring UIs just 40% off right now in general. So you can just go to refactoring UI and grab that.
yeah, cool. My talk is going to be a lot to get through. So if we start early, that's probably better. So
Okay. Let's do it. Take it away.
Okay. Do I have to share my screen myself?
Yep, you can share it. There's a share button and then share the screen there.
Cool.
That looks good.
All right. How's that?
Yep.
How do I hide this thing? That'll have to do, I guess.
You might be able to move it around.
Yeah. Okay. This is the curse of the Zoom. Okay, cool. So, hey, everybody. I'm Adam Wathan. I've spoken at other Laracons in the past, so you might be familiar with me. And today I'm here to talk about a CSS framework that I put out about a year and a half ago called Tailwind CSS. So kind of the short of it is imagine that you had to build like a component like this kind of card with like a cool background image, a little profile photo, some text and stuff like that. If you were trying to build this in sort of a, quote unquote traditional way using, like BEM or something similar to that, you might find yourself writing markup that looks sort of like this. So this is like all the necessary HTML elements to create this component, first of all, which is pretty out there. But you see like all these class names kind of really specific to the thing that we're building, this profile card. So here's like the header, the body, the user section, the avatar wrapper, the user details, individual stats, things like that. So you would write this markup, come up with your class names, sort of label everything, head over to your CSS, write all the styles that actually makes this work, and you'd sort of be good to go. If you're trying to build the same component with Tailwind, it would be all the same HTML elements, but the list of classes would be a lot different. It would look something more like this. So you can see here, we don't have any classes that look anything like profile card or anything, right? There's nothing really specific about the component that we're building. There are all these sort of really low-level presentational classes, like adding a border, rounding the corners, making the background white, setting it to display flex, making the width 1/3, making the font semi-bold, making the text, size 3XL, stuff like that. So this is kind of what it looks like to build stuff with Tailwind. You just sort of compose all these crazy little utilities and kind of create anything you want. The main difference between what we have here and what we have here is that in this example, there's a bunch of CSS that you have to write hiding in another file that's all very specific to this component. Whereas with Tailwind, you actually don't have to write any CSS at all to build this component. You just have to apply classes that Tailwind gives you to do this sort of thing. So today I'm not going to like focus on arguing the merits of this approach or anything, because it is pretty controversial, but there's a lot of good resources out there that kind of talk about the benefits of kind of implementing your designs using this approach. So today, instead, what I want to focus on is sort of how to actually use Tailwind to build real stuff and what it looks like to implement sort of common UI patterns and stuff like that. So I thought what we could do is basically just take a UI and sort of set Tailwind up and walk through building it from scratch with Tailwind, and I'll sort of narrate the process and sort of talk a little bit about my thought process and how I'm kind of doing it. So the thing that we're going to build, it might look a little bit familiar to you. It's actually a simplified version of the thing that Steve just designed in his talk. So if you were watching Steve's talk where he was sort of refactoring this Bootstrap-based UI to this really sort of custom design, thinking this looks really nice, but I don't really have the first clue how I would actually implement that with HTML and CSS, then hopefully you'll get a lot out of this talk as I show you how I would actually build something like this using Tailwind, because Tailwind is really perfectly suited for implementing like totally custom designs. Okay, so getting started. I'm gonna pull up Sublime here and Chrome, kind of set things up the way I need to make this work. We're on small screen here, so I gotta kind of do the 2/3 thing. Put this over here so we can kind of keep that out of the way. Okay, cool. So first things first, I've got like basically a brand new Laravel app here that's basically completely untouched. The only thing I've done really is set up browser sync so that we can easily kind of live reload our changes. But you can see I'm still using like Sass by default. I haven't set up Tailwind or anything like that. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of walk through what that looks like. So the first thing to understand about Tailwind is that it's a post CSS plugin. It's not like a special preprocessor or any proprietary thing like that. It's just a post CSS plugin. If that sounds like unfamiliar territory to you, you probably already use post CSS plugins, namely Auto Prefixer. Mix has that enabled by default, and you've probably used it in other projects too. So setting up Tailwind is basically exactly the same as setting up Auto Prefixer. The thing that's kind of neat about Tailwind being a post CSS plugin is that because post CSS kind of processes your CSS after all your preprocessor stuff, Tailwind is sort of like inherently compatible with any preprocessor. You can use Sass, Less, Stylus, Vanilla CSS, whatever you want. So I'm just going to use raw CSS because we're actually not going to really write much CSS, so we don't really need any of the fancy Sass features. So the first thing that we need to do is install Tailwind. So I've actually gone ahead and installed Tailwind already. So all you have to do is, if you're using npm, right, it's npm install Tailwind CSS save dev, or if you're using yarn, it's yarn add -d Tailwind CSS to add it as a dev dependency. We're going to be using sort of bleeding edge Tailwind, so I'm just kind of linking my local copy of sort of the pre-release version of 1.0 because that's going to be coming out in just a couple of weeks. I didn't want to give a talk on something that would be out of date 2 weeks from now, so we're right on the bleeding edge, so it's brand new stuff, and some of it's a little bit different than what's in the docs, but the docs will be updated in 2 weeks, and then you have this great talk that's perfectly up to date that you can reference later. So I've already installed Tailwind because I'm using my local copy, so I'm not going to run that command here. But once that's set up, the next step is basically to kind of set up Mix. So instead of using Sass, I'm just going to use the post CSS function, which basically just lets you take a raw CSS input file, specify where you want to output it, and specify the plugins. So we're just going to use an app.css file in the CSS directory, and we can add our plugins as just an array at the end here. So all we have to do here is just require Tailwind CSS. And now that's set up as a plugin. So how do we actually do anything with this? Well, the way that Tailwind works is basically internally it generates a ton of classes based on its internal configuration, as well as any customizations that you sort of layer on top of it, and that's something that we'll talk about later. So it generates all these classes using that information, and then it spits those classes out into your CSS file at these sort of different placeholders that you leave in your CSS. So let's create a CSS file. So I'm going to head over to this kind of base Sass file that's created by default. I'm just going to move this to the CSS directory, and I'm going to delete everything inside of it. Then I'm just going to delete the Sass folder. Okay, so to get started, there's 3 placeholders that you drop into a CSS file with Tailwind, where Tailwind's going to drop sort of 3 categories of CSS rules. So the first one is at Tailwind base. And these are your base styles like normalize.css, that sort of stuff, like resets and stuff. So Tailwind has like kind of a built-in, fairly opinionated reset that it's going to drop here by default. But Tailwind's plugin system can also be used to add more base styles if you have custom ones you want to add for your project. Next, we have Tailwind components. These are sort of like higher level abstractions like buttons, form inputs, stuff like that. Tailwind actually doesn't really ship with any of these. It comes with one component for doing like a responsive container. But that gets dropped at this placeholder as well as any components registered by plugins. Plugins is probably not something we're going to have time to get into in this talk, but it's kind of good to know why things are split up this way. The last piece is Tailwind utilities. And this is where all of the little atomic utility classes get output. And this is basically the meat of it, right? Like this is all the good stuff. So as long as we've done everything right here, if we go ahead and run yarn run dev, we should see we get a 421 kilobyte CSS file, which is huge, but don't worry about that. That's not actually a problem in practice. There's ways around that we'll talk about. But yeah, so that generates this CSS file, and you can see it starts with normalize, which is part of our reset. Eventually after normalize, it's got our one component class, which is our container. And then there's just a bunch of different utility classes for stuff like background color, border color, cursors, border widths, display, Flexbox stuff, everything. So your actual CSS file is really small. You just drop in the placeholders. Tailwind generates all the CSS based on its internal configuration merged with your configuration, and out it comes. That stuff we'll kind of get into in more detail as we go, but just to get things set up, this is all you need to know. Okay, so actually getting on to starting to implement this thing. So first thing I'm going to do is set up a watcher here so we can do the sort of live reload thing, so we can check this out in real time. And I got to move this thing out of the way so I can grab this tab. And yeah, here we go. So we're just starting with this empty home.blade.php file, literally nothing in it except pulling in Tailwind CSS file. And we're starting with a lot of room to breathe. Steve Sugar would really like this. Basically all breathing room. So here is the design that we're going to implement. It's sort of a simplified version of what Steve built in his talk. So we're not doing the table or the cards or anything because we're going to actually have a hard time just getting through what's here. So let's kind of get started. So the first thing that I want to do is kind of set up this background image. So you can see with the way we've kind of set up this design, we have this sort of full page background image, and I'm sort of expecting that as you resize the browser, that image would just sort of adapt to fit the viewport. So why don't we work on getting that set up first? So actually, before we even do that, the first thing that I like to do on any new kind of thing that I'm building with Tailwind is set up some base styles. So normally you might do that in your CSS file, right? You might say like, okay, well on the HTML element, I want to set a root font size and stuff like that. With Tailwind, the way that I would recommend doing that actually is just by adding Tailwind classes to the body or HTML tag. So in our case, there's a couple kind of useful defaults we can set up. First is like setting a default font family. So if you look at the docs for Tailwind, by default, we ship with 3 font families built in: a system UI, kind of sans serif, a nice cross-platform serif, and a cross-platform monospace font. You can, of course, add custom fonts. You can customize Tailwind as much as you want. We'll touch on that in some of the other pieces that we're getting into. But for this, I'm just going to default to using the sans serif font for the whole site. And Steve was using Barter Exchange. I don't have a copy of that font. So we're just going to use the system UI font instead. So we can just say font sans, and that'll kind of set up the default font family. So you'll see this changed a little bit, but it's kind of hard to tell. If we're using a crazier font, it'd be a little bit more noticeable. The next thing I like to set up is like a default line height for the whole page. So the browser default is like 1.15 or something. I think 1.5 is what Bootstrap and a lot of other frameworks use. It's kind of a nice, sensible default. So we can say letting normal, which is a Tailwind class, for setting a line height of 1.5, which is the normal value according to sort of Tailwind's configuration across the whole site. Letting is sort of the typographic term for line height. Sort of class names that you'll learn as you kind of get more proficient with Tailwind. The only other thing that I want to set up for now is this was done in Figma, and most design tools use a different anti-aliasing algorithm than the browser does for fonts. So text looks a little bit narrower in design tools than it does in the browser. You can, if we want things to look as similar as possible, so it's easier for us to compare designs, we're going to want to mimic that anti-aliasing that Figma uses. The easiest way to do that is to set the font smoothing property to anti-aliased instead of subpixel anti-aliased. Tailwind has a utility for that, just called anti-aliased. So you might not always do this on every project, but because we're going to try and match this design that came from a design tool, this will help us get a little bit closer. So that hasn't really gotten us anywhere so far, right? But now we kind of got a couple useful base styles in place, and we can think about actually setting up this design. So back to this background image. So we want it to stretch and kind of fill the whole screen. So how are we going to do that? I'm going to start by adding a div, and we'll give this div a class. Now we want this div to always fill the screen. We want the minimum height of this div to be the height of the viewport. We can do that in Tailwind by saying we want the min height, so min h, to match the screen. And if we go ahead and give this like a style like background red or something, you'll see now we have a div that fills the whole screen. Kind of like makes your eyes bleed, but there you go. Okay, so the background image. So I like to use inline styles for background images. Usually you end up having to do that a lot no matter what if you're using like user uploaded content anyways. So I don't really feel too guilty about having these little inline style tags in place for stuff like that. So we could do something like background image and then grab the URL to the image. In this case, I've just dumped it in the image folder called a hero.bg. So we can say hero.bg.jpg. Whoa. This Zoom toolbar always getting up in my business. You can't see it on your end, but it gets in the way of everything for me. Okay, so we kind of set this background image. We're not seeing anything. Oh, we gotta get the URL right, /image. Okay, so you can see like it's way too big and it's not kind of nicely centered like it is here. So we can use that trick Steve explained in his talk, setting the background size to cover to kind of shrink it down to only fill the necessary space. In Tailwind, that's just BG cover. So there we go. To be doubly safe, we can use BG center to make sure that it's going to always be centered and not aligned to the top left corner. And now as we kind of resize the browser, you can see like the image adjusts as necessary to make sure that it's always filling that space. So there you have it, getting somewhere. So the next thing I want to talk about is implementing this navbar at the top of the screen here. So the way that I like to actually build UIs with Tailwind is the first thing I do is kind of try and write all the generic skeleton markup without worrying about the styles. Just kind of looking at what's here and thinking, okay, what groups do I need to have? What needs to be grouped together? Am I going to need an extra div for that? That sort of thing. So in this case, we've kind of got like this container for all the nav stuff here, and we can use like a nice semantic class or a nice semantic element for that. Give it a nav element. And then inside of that, it looks like at kind of the most naive, simple version of this is really just two halves, right? So there's like this chunk of stuff here and this chunk of stuff here. So why don't we create two divs, one for the left half, one for the right half. So the next thing that I'm going to do is just kind of drop in the actual content. So it looks like we've got a logo here. I've got that logo down here. I've just got some SVGs saved away so we can kind of pull that in. So we've got an SVG for the logo. Yeah, let's get rid of the sidebar. Give us a little bit more room. And then we've got a link for flights, hotels, cars, vacations, deals. So we'll just have this link to nowhere for now. So we got flights, hotels, cars, vacations, deals. Let's just get this in there. Flights, hotels, cars, vacations, deals. And then similarly on the right, we just kind of got two links. Now the sign in looks like a button, but I think it would go to a sign-in page. It wouldn't actually submit a form or anything. So even though it looks like a button, semantically, it should still be a link. So I add trips and sign in. So let's go take a look at our implementation and see where we are. Oh, okay, not so good. So we got this giant, beautiful vector, nice and crisp logo here. And then we got some horrifying purple text down at the bottom. That's really hard to see. So why don't we start by just trying to size this image. So if we go ahead and head over to Figma, you can see I've got the design here. And if we look at this logo, it is 40 by 40, right? So if you want to use the exact dimensions from the design, you might think, well, why don't we just do something like, if we're happy to put values in the markup, let's just do width 40, height 40. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. There's some limitations of it when it comes to like wanting to change it responsively and stuff like that. But this would technically work. This isn't how I would do it typically though. Typically, I want to avoid just kind of dropping magic numbers into the HTML if I can, and instead depend on some sort of system. So that kind of gets us into another topic, which is one of the main benefits of Tailwind, in my opinion, is that it encourages you to build using like a design system. Tailwind has a design system built in that is customizable, like we talked about a million times. But one of the features of its design system is like a spacing and sizing scale. So I have a code pen here that kind of shows you the built-in Tailwind scale. So it starts all the way from 4 pixels and goes up all the way up to 256 pixels. Now internally in Tailwind, I sort of think of 4 pixels or 0.25 rem, which are the same value, using the default browser font size anyways. That's kind of like one Tailwind unit. So you can see 2 units is 8 pixels. Of course, 8 units is 32 pixels. It's just like simple proportional math. But this scale is sort of like a progressive, kind of not quite exponential, but exponential-ish scale where we start with values that are really tightly kind of spread, right? So there's only a 4 pixel difference between most of these ones. But by the time you get up here, there's actually 32 pixels difference between this one and this one. And this is because at the low end of the scale, it's useful to be able to fine tune between 8 pixels and 12 pixels of padding, for example. But up at the top end, when you're sizing some big element or adding like a really big chunk of margin or something, fine tuning between 256 pixels and 252 pixels is not really productive or useful. Tailwind tries to provide you with some useful constraints to help you sort of design faster and avoid like nitpicking on tiny things that don't really matter. And it also helps your interface to stay more consistent if you kind of stick to the scale. So the way that I would usually work is I would see, okay, it's supposed to be 40 pixels. What's the closest thing in our scale to 40 pixels? Looks like we have 40 pixels bang on, which is like 10 Tailwind units. So instead of using width 40, height 40, I would just add a class here. And I would say I want the height to be 10 Tailwind units and the width to be 10 Tailwind units. And if we head back here, we should see we have like the same output. So we still have like that 40 pixel thing. Okay, so next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make all these links white just so we can see them, but we're not going to go any further than that with the link styling. We'll get back to structural stuff instead. Okay, so let's just grab all these links. We'll just say class is text white. This is how we set the text to white, pretty intuitive. So now we can at least see it. So let's head back to this mockup. Next thing I want to do is basically put these elements in the right place. So the first thing that you'll notice is that trips and sign-in is below this list right now. We want them next to each other. So one way that you might think to do that is using floats back in the day. They're kind of a bad idea these days because we have better solutions. The better solution is to use Flexbox. So to use Flexbox to solve this problem, what we need to do is add a class to the parent container, which is like this whole block, turning it into a Flex container. So that's just classes Flex, that's it. And that already gets us a little bit closer. You can see things are at least next to each other now. Now, Flexbox has a bunch of ways to sort of control the position of children. So in this case, this div is a child and this div is a child. If we want to control where they're positioned horizontally, we can use the justify content CSS property. In Tailwind, those are all shortened to just justify and then sort of the value. So the default is justify flex start, which kind of puts everything at the beginning. We could say justify end, puts everything at the end. We could say justify center to put everything in the middle. Justify around puts equal space around everything. Or justify between kind of slams everything to the left and right. So I use this combination of classes constantly because this is a really common pattern in UI design. You'll see it even appears elsewhere in this design. Like down here, we have that same thing where there's some stuff on the left and then some stuff on the right. So Flexbox is really, really useful for tackling this problem. Okay, so we've kind of like put things generally in the right place. I think the next thing that we want to do is try and get this text and this text vertically aligned. This was impossible to do with floats without doing a bunch of calculations, and it was awful. Way easier to do in Flexbox. So all we have to do is say, Just like we can kind of justify things horizontally, we can align things vertically using the align items property. So if we say items center, that centers these two children with each other. Now, it doesn't look centered to your eye, but it actually is, in the sense that if you look at this div, and then this div is shorter, but this div is vertically centered with this div. It's just that the text happens to be at the bottom, so those aren't aligned yet. So let's tackle that part next. Okay, so if we want to get this text to be vertically aligned with this image, again, historically, it used to be a nightmare. With Flexbox, trivial. So all we need to do is make this element a flex container as well. Set it to item center again, just like the other one. And now that's centered, and all this text is centered with each other. You can see the baselines of all the text actually matches perfectly, so we're good to go. All right, next step. Why don't we style the links? So if you look at the actual Figma file, you can see that the links are font size 16, which is the default, bold, and the text is white. So we've already got the white part down. So let's make it bold. So I'm just going to select all these at the same time. We'll say font bold to set the font to bold. Again, pretty intuitive. It's close. We got underlines though, so we want to get rid of the underlines. Well, if we want no underlines, the easy way to do that is to just say so. No underline. Underline gone. Cool. Spacing is a little bit messed up, right? If you look here, you can see, if we look at this at full zoom level, the distance from like this image to this text is about 32 pixels. If we check our spacing scale, 8 units is 32 pixels. So why don't we add some margin to the first element, some left margin using the ML utility. So we can say ML, what did I say, 8? 8. And that'll give us that margin that we were looking for. Let's check these other ones. In between these two, I think it's a little bit tighter. So it looks like it's, I don't know, maybe 26. Here we don't have a value like 26. So what I usually do in these cases is I just kind of assume that the designer wasn't really being super, super picky about trying to follow any sort of scale and was just kind of eyeballing it. And usually that's true. And if I just pick the closest thing from the existing scale, the designer never even notices or cares. And that's definitely the case when I'm working with Steve. So in this case, this is 2 pixels off. I'm willing to make that 2 pixel trade-off to stick to the scale, to have some sort of system. So we'll use 6 for these ones. So we'll just do ML6. And now those are spaced out a little bit better. Same sort of thing over here. If we check, I think this gap is probably similar. Yeah, 24. So we can do an ML6 on the sign-in. Okay, so this is getting closer, right? And obviously it's not perfect. I think the next thing that we should do is maybe get this vertical padding set up. So you can see there's some padding at the top and the bottom. So if we look from this bottom border up to this image, that is either 24, 20? Call it 20. I think there's a good, yeah, there's 20 here. So we can add some padding to the top and bottom of this container by saying padding top, PT 5, because it's 5 Tailwind units, and PB 5. Now if we head back here, yeah, we got some padding. It's really common to have symmetrical padding on elements, so you can kind of shortcut this by just saying PY. All right, does the same thing. The next thing is, I think maybe we'll deal with the container. So you can see ours is kind of full width, right? But in the mockup, it doesn't go all the way to the edges. There's sort of like either some padding or a fixed width. I'm pretty sure if you were to make this bigger, you wouldn't want the actual elements to get bigger. So this is kind of like a layout width. So we have to kind of figure out how to do that. So let's kind of just measure what we got here. It looks like this is about 972 pixels. So the way that you kind of lay out big kind of blocks in Tailwind typically is using the max width utilities, because we don't want to give this a fixed width, because if the browser shrunk, we'd want the container to sort of stay fluid with the browser. But we do want to say, like, we don't want it to get any bigger than 972 pixels in this case. So just like spacing, Tailwind has a built-in scale for these max width elements because it's such a kind of critical way to lay things out. So here's kind of the max width scale in Tailwind. I don't have the values here, but you can see it kind of steps up kind of gradually, just like the spacing scale. So we want to pick something as close to 972 as possible. So if we kind of measure this, that's about 900. This one is about 1024. So this is the closest one, but it is a little bit bigger. I think that's okay though, because if you think about it, we wouldn't want everything to go right to the edge anyways. We'd probably want a little bit of padding inside of that. So if we give this a max width of 5XL plus a little bit of padding, I think we'll probably get pretty close. So we could add that max width directly to the nav, but if you look at the mockup, you can see that that max width actually constrains the whole screen, right? Even the form and everything. So I think it's probably a better idea to create another parent that can be used as sort of like the container that controls everything, and everything inside of it sort of adapts to this container. So we'll give this div a max width of 5XL. What am I typing here? Goodness gracious. And now if we expand this, you can see it is constrained, but it's not centered. So to center a block level element with a defined width in CSS, we have to give it auto margins on the left and right. So in Tailwind, we can say ML auto, MR auto, and that will center it. And then just like the PY padding trick that we talked about, you can just use MX auto if you have symmetrical margins on the left and right, so the x-axis. That gives us the same result. Now, this doesn't have any padding built in, so you'll see once we get here, it just goes right to the edge. I don't think that's probably what we want. So why don't we add some padding? Let's take a look at our spacing scale. Maybe like a 6, kind of like a nice, generous amount of padding would be good. So now we have something that kind of resizes fluidly and has a little bit of padding, but is still constrained. So I think that's pretty good. Next, let's take a look at this button style. Okay, so taking a look at the actual CSS here, or sorry, at the design, you can see we've got this button with a border with 20% opacity. So it's like a mostly transparent white. Tailwind actually doesn't have semi-transparent colors built in, so this will be a good place to explore customizing Tailwind a little bit. But why don't we start with just a solid border and see where we can get. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that we give us a display value of inline block because links are inline by default, and inline elements don't really accept padding the same way as block elements. They're not really designed to have vertical padding added to them. It doesn't really count towards its computed height the same way. So it's best to give it an inline block display type so that it actually accepts the values you're trying to give it properly. So this shouldn't really change anything in the design. You can see it still looks the same. We can go ahead and maybe add a border by just using the border class. So you see we get like, this is actually kind of a really light gray square border. So why don't we make it white for now? Looks basically the same because it's so thin it's hard to tell. In the mockup, it looks like it's got rounded corners. So we can just use the rounded helper to kind of add the rounded corners. And I think we need some padding. So let's take a look here. It's got a little bit more on the left and right than it does on the top. So why don't we start with like PX4, PY2. It's kind of like my go-to for buttons usually. So that looks like a, you know what? That's actually not far off, but it's maybe a tiny bit too tall. We could go with PY3. That's way too tall. So what I'll do instead in this case is I'll kind of cheat a little bit and play with the line height also to see if I can get a height that kind of looks good to my eyes. So instead of using, I think actually this is set to a line height of 1.5, right? Because we set that as a default on the body. If we use letting tight, that's a little bit tighter, and that should bring the height down a little bit by default. So it's still too tall. If we go with like letting tight PY2, I mean, yeah, that looks pretty good to me. It's not perfect. It's maybe a pixel or two off, but I think it looks pretty good. So let's worry about getting this color right for the border color now. So like I said, Tailwind doesn't have like alpha variants of solid colors built in, at least not currently. Maybe something we explore for a future update. But again, easy to customize. So it's a good opportunity to introduce customization in Tailwind. So to get started, you need to create a Tailwind config file. In Tailwind o.x, you kind of always needed a config file, and you had to specify the path to it when you were requiring Tailwind here. In Tailwind 1.0, it'll auto-discover it as long as you follow the conventional name and location of the file. So if we just create a new file inside the root of the project, kind of where you'd put your Webpack config, Babel config, stuff like that, call it tailwind.config.js. Tailwind will start automatically picking up our customizations here. So this file is real simple. We just got to export a configuration object because it's just a JavaScript file. If we want to change any of the styles or the design system stuff, all that stuff lives under the theme option. So in this case, we want to add some colors. So by default, when we do something like colors to specify the colors that Tailwind is going to use, this is going to override the defaults. If you just want to extend the built-in defaults, you can do that inside this extend key. So we could say extend colors with some custom colors here, but still use all the defaults. In this case, if you take a look at Figma, Steve has done a pretty good job of creating a nice color palette for us to use here. And on a lot of projects that you'll work on, especially if you're working with designers, they'll have a color palette that they want you to use anyways. So it's not uncommon to override all of the built-in colors in Tailwind. So why don't we take like the override approach, because we're going to be using Steve's colors that he so nicely created for us here anyways. So the only color we're actually using in the design so far is white, right? So we're going to want to make sure that we keep white. And white is just white, just as simple as that. Now, if we want to add this 20% transparent white or 20% opaque white, actually, first we have to think of what do we want the class name to be. So this is used as sort of a suffix. So it's like text dash whatever we put here. I kind of like white 20. It's kind of like the 20% opacity version of white. And we can actually implement that by using RGBA. We can say 255, 255, 255, 0.2, right? And that'll be our 20% opacity white. And this will work. I kind of think this isn't the best way to use Tailwind, though, or to customize Tailwind. I think if you find yourself coming to this config file and adding these one-off values a lot, you're sort of getting yourself into a situation that's not unlike writing a lot of custom CSS, where you're constantly editing stuff, creating one-off values. It just kind of like you're throwing away a lot of the benefits of having a system that you're using as a set of constraints. So in this case, even though the design only calls for a 20% opaque white, I would prefer to have like a scale of alpha whites that I could refer to if needed. If another piece of design came in that used maybe 80% or something, I don't want to have to come back and edit this all the time. I'd rather just define a scale once, sort of invest the time to do that, and then use that as a constraint going forward. So maybe we'll do like 20%, 40%, 60%, and 80%. So we have like steps of 20 all the way up to full white. So we could just duplicate this and add those all in. But there's kind of like a nice sort of shortcut way to do this in Tailwind 2. If you're specifying a bunch of variants of an individual color, you can specify an object. So here we could do, for just the white with no suffix, that's just going to be the default white, right? Now for the 20% opacity white, we can just specify the 20. And then we can grab this value. And then we can do the same thing to get like 40 through 80. So that's 20, 40, 60, 80. Cool. Why don't we try and do, this is not going to be worth it. We'll just do one at a time. I was going to try to do some Sublime Text Wizardry, but there's too many other 2s in the list. Cool. So now we have like a nice scale of semi-transparent whites to work with. So anyways, now if we get back to our HTML here, if we want to use the semi-transparent white border, we can just say border white 20. Now I think we're going to have to restart our build because we added the config file after the build was already started. But from here, it should pick up our changes to the config file automatically going forward. Okay, so let's, I don't know if live reload will sync to the old instance, but we'll just pull those over. Okay, so we do a hard refresh. Okay, so now we got our semi-transparent border. So that's looking pretty good. Heading over to the mockup again, you can see we have a border underneath the whole nav that's the same color as the button border. So we can do that just by adding a border white 20. Now you're going to see that this actually gives us a full border around the whole thing. We don't want that. We just want it on the bottom, right? So to do that, instead of specifying border, which defaults to all sides, I'm just going to say border B, and we're just going to go to the bottom. Good to go. Cool. So that's basically the nav, kind of this like naive version of it done anyways. So let's move on. So let's do this kind of header section. So we're going to add a section under the nav here. And let's just do the same approach that we were using before. We're just kind of dropping the skeleton. So where will you be flying today? And we'll do a P tag. And what is it? Travel the world at prices you wouldn't believe. Travel the world at prices you wouldn't believe. Let's make sure we use a proper quote here. What is it? RS quo? Yeah, looks great, right? Okay, so one thing that you'll notice that is kind of worth pointing out is that Tailwind unstyles all your headings by default. And this is to encourage you to be very intentional about setting an actual font size instead of just getting whatever the default is. I think it leads to people creating better designs. So looking at the mockup, we can see that this heading is font size 48. This is font size 30. If we head over to, I've got a type scale for Tailwind, just like the spacing and the max width, we've got a type scale. You can see we do have 30 and 48 already conveniently. So we can do 5XL and 3XL for this. So we'll do text 5XL for the headline, text 3XL for the sub headline. And there you go. Doesn't look very good, right? So why don't we center this text? So we can just use text center to slam that in the middle. And why don't we set the headline to white, since that's what it's supposed to be, right? And then this bottom one is actually this like nice accent blue color that you can see Steve has here. So we're gonna have to pull in all these colors now, because now we finally need a color that's not white. So I've already got those in a file ready to go. So I'm just gonna paste them into our customizations. So you can see I've got our grays, which are here, our blues, which are here and here, and then our yellows, which are over here. So I'm just using 9 values for each one. That's what kind of Steve gave me. And then there's a special accent blue just for like text. It kind of uses that tip he talked about in his talk of rotating the hue to make it a little bit brighter. So we're head over to the config, paste those values in, make sure we don't got any weird syntax errors or anything. And now we've kind of got our color palette in place. So this blue accent color is the one that we want to use for this text. So if we just say text blue accents, that should get us pretty close. Yeah. All right. A little bit of padding, maybe. It looks like it's, first thing to note is that we do have a little bit of padding here already, but just kind of based on the line height. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball this. I don't actually usually look at the Tailwind scales. I just kind of spitball and try numbers and use my eye and just test up or down until I get where I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with like PY16 maybe. What does that get us? Looks like its text is a little bit too low. But I think we can counteract that by maybe reducing the line height a little bit on this headline, because I think this gap is a little bit bigger than I would like anyways. It's pretty close to what Steve has actually, but I'm going to make an executive decision. I like headlines that are a little bit tighter. So if we go letting tight, that'll tighten it up a little bit. Gets it closer to where Steve had it. And I think looks pretty good. We could maybe drop this down to like 12. Yeah, and that's even closer to what Steve had. So let's just roll with that. That's pretty good. Moving right along. We don't have to make any changes there. Let's check out this card at the bottom, this form. So since it is a form, I will use a form element. Let's space these sections out so we can kind of more easily identify them. So we'll just have it go nowhere, method equals post, whatever, just so it kind of looks realistic. And then let's figure out what we need to do. So using that same approach, we're just going to kind of skeleton out the markup, then fill in the styles. So it looks like this form, this card sort of has two halves, right? There's a top white section and then a bottom gray section. So already that's going to be two containers at least. In the top section, we sort of have two rows. We got a row of radio buttons and then we got a row of form fields. So that's another two divs. In the bottom section, we kind of have a left section and a right section. So that's another, you guessed it, two divs. Okay, so that's kind of the basic structure. Now in the top, let's kind of drop in these radio buttons. So the way I like to do radio buttons, the easiest way to kind of make them nice to use is to wrap them in their label, so you don't have to worry about doing the label for with the ID and stuff. So what I'll usually do is I'll do a label, get rid of the for, then inside we'll just drop what we need. So we're going to need an input type radio. Looks like this is like the trip type, round trip, one way, or multi-city. So why don't we do like a name equals trip type, just so it's clickable. Value is round trip. Oh my goodness. And then we have the actual label for it. So that we can style the label, I'm going to wrap it in a span so we can add classes to it if necessary. So I'll do round trip. And then let's just make three of those. So this one I think was one way. One way. Oh, can't forget Steve's little dash. And multi-city with a little dash. And we'll set the value on that too. Okay, so that's kind of like very basic markup for those radio buttons. Again, not worrying about styling. We're just kind of get all the bones into place. I guess my daughter's doing something bad. Down here, we kind of got a grid of labels and inputs. So same sort of deal. I'm going to create a label to wrap it all up so that the whole thing is clickable. And then we'll have a span for the label at the top. So this will be like origin city, for example. And then we'll just put the input underneath that. And why don't we give the inputs their values? It's supposed to be Toronto, Ontario. For now, I'm going to skip these icons because I don't think we're going to have time to get through absolutely everything. And there's like more critical features of Tailwind and things that you need to know how to do that I think are more important to get to. So we'll leave that to the very end in case we have time. Probably same with the custom radio button styling. So we'll just keep it simple for now so we can get to the most important stuff. And if we have time, we can jump into that stuff. Okay, so we'll do the same thing for destination, San Francisco, California. Depart, return. And that's Sunday 14/4 to Thursday 18/4. Short little business trip. Travelers, one adult. Okay, so that's kind of that skeleton in place. Now let's look at the bottom. So we got two checkboxes with labels and a button on the right. So I'm just going to grab one of these radios because checkboxes and radios, the structure is going to be really, really similar. So we have a label, and then we're going to have an input type checkbox. The name is going to be, what is it? Add hotel and add car. So why don't we just say add hotel, value of true, add a hotel, and add a car, var car. Been writing too much legacy JavaScript, I guess. And then down here in this other half, we'll slam in that button. In this case, this is a real button because it's actually going to submit a form. So we'll do button type submit to make that really clear. Just kind of keep this as real world as possible. We'll just do search flights. Again, we'll leave out the icon for now. If we have time, we'll get back to that. And I think that's kind of all the pieces that we need. So that's kind of just the markup. Head back here and zoom you and your drop down. Get out of my face. Okay. So this is looking pretty good, I think. Almost ready for production. So obviously this looks like trash. So let's jump back to the mockup and start dropping things in. So first thing that I think we should do is maybe add a background color for the top half and the bottom half. So here's the top half. So let's just say BG white. And the bottom half, BG who knows. Let's see. If we head over to Figma and I click through here, you can see we're using this cool feature of Figma called color styles that lets us actually pull from the color palette with named values, which makes it really easy for me to see which color in the palette I should use in Tailwind. So this is Steve's blue-gray 100. That maps to my just gray 1. I got rid of the 0 zeros at the end of everything to kind of save space. So I know that all I have to type here to get this right is BG gray 1. Now, if I was working on a project that wasn't as well organized as this, I would just literally do trial and error until it looked pretty close. I probably would have guessed 1 or 2 to start, and if it was too dark, I would have moved down 1. If it was too light, I would have moved up 1. Okay, so we got the background colors in place. It's not looking too hot still, though. The mockup has this nice big border radius on the parent form. So let's add that. So we'll do class. Let's just start with rounded. And interesting, we see nothing happens. Now, the reason for this is that the children have a background color, and the children still have square corners. So those corners poke outside of the parent. So if we want the parent to sort of mask the children, we have to hide any overflowing content. So we can do that with overflow hidden. And now you can see we get a little bit of border radius there. Now the mockup has a nice big border radius. So why don't we jump up? Of course, we have a scale for border radius like we do for everything else. If you head over to the border radius docs, you can see we've got rounded small, kind of the medium default one, and then a large one by default. So why don't we go with rounded large and see if that looks pretty good. I think that looks pretty close to what Steve has in terms of the border radius. Okay, so we're getting there. Next step, I think, would be some padding. So it looks like we got 32 pixels of padding. That is our Tailwind unit 8, right? So if we do, and I know that because 32 divided by 8 is 4, which is a single Tailwind unit. So we do px8 here. We get a little bit of horizontal padding. Vertical padding, let's measure this one. It's the easiest one to measure. This looks like it's either 24 or you could stretch it to 32. I would say probably 24 is the one we want to roll with here. So maybe we'll do a py6. Yeah, and that's kind of a decent starting point. We can add the padding to the bottom one too while we're here maybe. Keep pulling up that friggin' zoom toolbar that no one else can see, so you think I'm crazy. So we want the left and right padding to be the same, but the top and bottom padding, now you'd be naive to measure it here because that's not the real padding. The real padding is the minimum padding, which is this area over here. So in this case, it's actually only about 12 pixels. So let's head down to this chunk here. We'll go with px8 because it's the same. And then 12 divided by 4, right, to get the value is going to be py3. So yeah, there we go. Still not looking very good, but we're getting closer. So one thing worth noting is if you take a look at the text, all our text here looks black. And this text is like not quite black. It's a little bit of a softer gray. If we check out Figma, you can see Steve is using gray 8. He's actually using it for like all of the text here. It's kind of like the default, black text, so to speak. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, why don't we just use text gray 8 as our default font color for the site, so that anything that we don't assign a font color to, we'll have that. And now everything got a little bit lighter except the inputs, because inputs actually have a black text that you have to override. Something we might try to fix for Tailwind 1.0. It's not really a Tailwind problem. It's just kind of what the browser does, but we might be more heavy-handed in our reset for that. Okay, let's deal with this spacing. Okay, so what do we got? We got about 30. So it's either 24 or 30, depending on how you cut it. We're going to be using smaller inputs or radio buttons because I'm not going to do the custom ones just yet. So maybe we'll go with a smaller value. So let's head up to the radio buttons. And between each radio button, let's do like a margin left 6. Class ML6. Okay. Similarly, we're going to want some space between the radio button and the text. So how about in each one of these spans, we do the same thing, like a margin left of 2 or 3, maybe? Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Let's go with 2. Now, to be able to more finely control the positioning, all this stuff is inline right now. If we switch to Flexbox, it'll get rid of any weird gaps and things and let us kind of control things in a much more good way, honestly. So I'm just going to add flex to this. So all the children become flex containers. You can see it pulls things in a little bit tighter, which I think is okay. If anything, maybe that means that we jump to like an ML8 to kind of spread things out a little bit more. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. And then I think what I'm going to do is, I think that's actually okay. We can just leave like that for now. If we were doing the custom checkboxes or the custom radios, we might do some things a little bit differently right now. But again, maybe something we can get to later if we have time. Okay, let's look at this stuff down below now, all these ugly form fields. So if you look at the mockup, what we have here is like a grid, right? It's like 4 equal columns. Tailwind doesn't include any grid utilities, but it does include Flexbox utilities and width utilities, which makes it really easy to build grids. So let's start by just making this a flex container, and we should see everything kind of jumps closer to where it needs to be. I'm going to start by giving all these labels like a background color. Maybe we'll just do like BG blue 3 or something. And this way we can kind of just see the outline of them, so we kind of know what we're working with. So right now these are all just kind of an equal width, just kind of by coincidence, but we kind of probably want to force that. So the way to do that in Tailwind is by adding an explicit width. So if we want everything to be 25%, then we can say width 1/4. Now, nothing really changed too significantly, but everything is kind of locked into place now. One thing you'll notice that's a little bit weird is these inputs aren't full width. That's because inputs are inline block by default. So if we switch those inputs to be block in width full, because they also have this weird browser inherent width, then we should see those take up the full space. Yeah, this blue background is still behind those. You just can't really see it because it's perfectly covered up. Okay, so the next thing is there's a little bit of a gap between each one, right? So how can we simulate that? The best way to do that I know is by adding padding to each one of these columns to spread them out a little bit, and then figuring out how to sort of undo the padding on the outside so we don't have extra gutters. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's start with like a PX2. All right, so we got a little bit of space. We can maybe go PX3, and PX2 is good. But you can see now like this text is not aligned anymore with this radio button because everything's kind of got a little bit of padding on the outside. You could try and work around it by only adding padding on the inner items, but it gets really complicated trying to get the measurements right. An easier approach is to just add a negative margin on the parent to compensate for the extra padding. So just like you can do a regular horizontal margin in Tailwind like MX2, we can use a negative horizontal padding by just sticking a minus sign or dash in front. So that pulls everything back out, and now you can see the text is aligned with the button, or with the radio button. Okay, let's get rid of these blue backgrounds because we don't really need them anymore. And work on styling this stuff. Okay, so next thing is like the font for the label. So it's semi-bold, 14 pixels, and it's gray 8. All right, so we'll just say class is font semi-bold because that's the font we want to use. We want to set to 14 pixels. So if we look at the text sizing scale, 14 pixels is text SM, so text small. So I'll set that there. And like that's already getting us quite a bit closer. So let's get these inputs down. Again, we're going to skip the icons because we only got 15 minutes left and we got stuff to get through. But yeah, style those. So let's check out Figma here. So we got a background of gray 1 and a border of gray 2. So let's just start with the background and the border. So I'll say BG gray 1, border, and then border gray 2, because this is just enabling the border and this is setting the color. All right, we're going to want rounded corners on that and probably some padding. So I'll just start PX4, PY2. Those are much smaller than what Steve had. So why don't we go maybe like PY3, PX5. They're still a tiny bit short. I think we can fix that with line height. So why don't we say that we want to give these letting normal or maybe letting tight. We'll see. That's not too bad, really. That's like pretty close. I think without the icon, they feel a little bit big. So why don't we use letting tight instead, which will kind of shrink it just a hair. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. The text is also black, like we talked about before. So let's set that to text gray 8, like our default text is for everything else. And that looks pretty good. Okay, next, we got some spacing issues. We got to have some space between these two rows and some space between the label and the input. So I'm going to start by adding the space between the two rows. Let's just do like an MT4 or something to see where that gets us. And that's pretty close, actually. It feels like pretty good. Let's scroll all the way up here. Yeah, it seems okay. I think we need a little bit more padding at the bottom of our thing here, though. So why don't we go with like a PT12 and maybe like a PB16? Close enough for what we're trying to do. Okay, let's add a little bit of margin above each input. Okay, so I'm going to grab all these inputs, and I'm just going to say MT1, just kind of the smallest one, just a little bit of padding. Yeah, and that's pretty good. Okay, let's jump down to the bottom half and get that banged out pretty quick here. So we're going to want to do the same thing, I think, where we set the container for the labels to be flexed so we can kind of more easily control them. I think we need to set the whole thing to flex too, and item center, because we want to center these two chunks and probably justify between to slam the button over to the right. And then for each one of these, let's just add a little bit of margin on the left. That's probably too much, maybe 2. And then space this one out from the other one a little bit. ML4, oh, typo. And maybe ML6. Might even have to go bigger than that. Let's see what that looks like. You can probably go ML8. We're not using the big check boxes that Steve was using, so probably don't want to go too far spaced out, but I think that's probably a pretty good start. Okay, what about this button? So let's take a look at the Figma thing. So the background is yellow 400 and the text is yellow 900. So let's just start by giving the button a reasonable default line height because the browser's default is going to mess with our stuff. We'll say BG yellow, what do we say, 400? 400 and 900. So BG yellow 4, text yellow 9. And it looks like we need the font to be bold. So we'll say font bold. And then we're going to need some padding and rounded corners. So maybe PX. Traditionally, we've needed more padding than I've expected on this design. So you know what? That's actually pretty good. Yeah, cool. All right. That's as far as I'm going to go with actually implementing the design because we've got 10 minutes left and I'd like to get through a couple other features of Tailwind that are going to be really important. So the first thing is right now, none of this stuff is responsive, right? Like if we kind of do this, everything just falls apart. We got to make it responsive. So how do you make things responsive in Tailwind? It's actually pretty simple. Every single utility in Tailwind can be applied only at specific breakpoints if you like. So let's start with maybe this grid here. Say like when we get to like a smaller size, we actually want this to go to like a 2x2 sort of grid. How would we do that? Well, similar to how Bootstrap's columns and stuff work, Tailwind has like a small, medium, large, and extra large screen size. The way that you apply something at only a specific screen size is by prefixing it. So we could just say something like XL W1/4 to say we only want it to be width 1/4 on extra large screens. I think for our purposes, we probably want it to be width 1/4 on like large screens and above. And maybe by default, we'll do like width 1/2. Now we're not going to see any difference here. And that's because our flexing container isn't allowing items to wrap. So if we add flex wrap, things will be able to wrap. And now we're pretty close to kind of a responsive design. It looks like we're going to need a little bit of padding between each one. So we could say like by default, maybe we have a margin top of 4 on the last two because they're in the second row. And that looks pretty good. But then when we get to the big size, you can see things are kind of messed up. So just like we can set the width responsively, we can, at large screens, say there should be no margin top and kind of undo that responsively too. So that's fixed, but it still looks pretty good there. So that's kind of the basics of like doing responsive design with Tailwind. If we wanted to, you know, Steve had that tip about how form fields shouldn't be too long. So maybe we want to shrink this whole container at this width. So we don't want things to kind of cram into each other, but here it's actually a little bit too much space. So we could do something like head over to the form, and we could say, maybe the form has like a max width of 3XL and it's centered, but on large screens, there is no max width. It can max out at full. And now it'll kind of just like, oh yeah, it's a little bit tidier, like a nice little size there. Maybe on mobile screens, we actually want to stack everything entirely, right? So we could do the same thing. Instead of width 1/2 by default, maybe it's actually width full by default. But on small screens and above, it's width 1/2. So once we get to like here, oh, now it stacks. We might want to add a little bit of margin above this one now. So maybe this one by default has margin top of 4 too, but we undo that responsively at the small breakpoint instead, right? Same sort of deal. So we could do a lot more to kind of make the whole thing responsive, like make the navbar responsive and stuff, but we only got 10 minutes left. I'd like to get through a couple other kind of key things. So another thing we're missing is sort of like interactivity in a sense, right? Like normally a button would have like a hover state, you might have like custom focus states for things. How do you do that with Tailwind? Just like responsive prefixes, we also have state prefixes. So if I want to change this background color on hover, all I have to do is say, okay, Steve likes it to be a little lighter on hover. Okay, so on hover, we'll do BG yellow 3. Now it's a little bit lighter when you hover over it. It's the next one up in the scale. Similarly, if we want to change a focus style, like right now this uses the default browser outline, which is fine, but the thing I don't like about it is it doesn't follow border radiuses. So if we wanted to disable that, we could just say on focus, we want no outline. You don't want to do this without providing your own focus styles because it's bad for accessibility. But say we wanted to add like a little box shadow, a nice little blue outline shadow. We could say on focus, add Tailwind's built-in outline shadow, which kind of looks like a regular outline, but it's a little bit nicer because it follows the border radius. Well, now you get that nice little outline. Similarly, for these inputs, say you didn't like that styling, you could do something like focus outline none, and now we just have no focus styling, which is no good. But if you wanted to maybe make the background white on focus, you could do focus BG white. And now when I focus it, you can see that changes to a white background, so you can see which one is enabled. Okay, so there's a bunch more stuff we could do with responsive and stuff like that, but I think kind of I've explained sort of the gist of it, right? Like it's basically just add a prefix, undo styles, re-add styles, kind of do it, whatever you need to do. But the one question that I think people are left with a lot when they see stuff built this way is like, this looks like a maintainability nightmare. You've got these 4 inputs that all have all the exact same classes on them. And if I want to change one of them, I have to somehow find them all in my project and change them all. That's a really valid point, and it would be a maintainability nightmare. If you wanted them all to update at the same time, well, a more traditional CSS approach where you have like a single source of truth makes a lot of sense. So how would you kind of handle that problem in Tailwind? Well, you might think, okay, well, maybe what I do is I create a form input class and I just kind of type out all these styles. I add border radius, whatever, padding left, whatever, padding right, whatever, figure out what all the values are, just kind of add them all in here. But that's kind of a horrible experience, right? The nice thing about Tailwind is that all of Tailwind's utility classes can actually be used as mix-ins using this special syntax we came up with called apply. So check this out. I can just go here. I can grab this entire list of classes. I can paste those in here to apply them. Now, one caveat is it doesn't work with focus styles just yet, but there's a workaround for that. I can apply all those styles. Now out here, I can actually just say form input. If we did it right, it still looks exactly the same except for the focus styles. So if we wanted to add the focus styles, all we'd have to do is just add them to the focus pseudo selector. So we can say apply, and instead of adding the focus variants, we would just say on focus, we want no outline, and we want a shadow outline instead. So yeah, now that's going to work. Or sorry, we want a BG white. That's what we were doing. So now if we head back here, we can grab this list of styles, replace that with form input, and now we've sort of extracted a component that's based on all of our utilities. So it's still based on the same design system, but now we can update it all in one place. So it's a nice sort of like progressive approach where you can kind of prototype in utilities, and then once you start having painful duplication, you can extract it into your own custom components. In this particular case, I probably wouldn't extract every single one of these classes. Specifically, this MT1 kind of gives me a bit of pause because that's very contextual. This is only really here because of the label above it. So I might remove that and actually keep the MT1 in each case, because this way the form input is more reusable in situations where maybe there is no label and stuff like that. So yeah, that's kind of like the gist of it. One other thing that I wanted to talk about actually quickly is by default, Tailwind's output is really, really large because it's generating so many classes. It's deceptively large because it actually compresses really, really, really well with gzip, and even better with Brotli. With Brotli, it's actually smaller than Bootstrap, even though the raw size is double what Bootstrap's raw size is. But all that aside, there's still a better approach to kind of keeping your CSS kind of slim, and that's using this library called Purge CSS. With Laravel specifically, the folks at Spotsy have a really good package that you can pull in called Laravel Mix Purge CSS, which I've pulled in already. And this is pre-configured to sort of work properly with Tailwind out of the box. So if we want to only ship the styles that we're actually using to the browser, all we have to do is require Laravel Mix Purge CSS, call Purge CSS in Mix. Then if we run yarn run production, oh, I made a mistake. Can't find module, Laravel Mix Purge CSS. What did I do? Laravel Mix Purge CSS, did I spell it wrong? Oh, we pulled in Purge CSS, but not Laravel Mix Purge CSS. Yarn add -g. Kind of had this misprepared for everyone, sorry about that. It'll only take a second anyways. Cool. So if we run a production build, and then we do an ls on the public directory, well, actually, you can just see right here. The compiled CSS is 4 kilobytes instead of like 300 kilobytes, which it was before. And if we did everything right, and we go to tailwind travel.test, everything still works, right? So that's everything I have time for. I don't want to shortchange you though by not covering some of the hairier parts, right? Like the custom form elements and stuff like that. So I think what I'm going to do is tomorrow I'm going to record a screencast that's sort of a part 2 of this presentation where we'll kind of finish it off and do some of the more advanced funky stuff. And I'll give that to Ian and he can email that out to everybody when he sends out the other videos. So you sort of get 2 talks for the price of 1, and we'll keep that kind of secret just for the Laracon online attendees. So that's basically all I got. If you're interested in learning more about Tailwind, tailwindcss.com is the docs. You can read about it there. I've got this pinned issue in the repo called Tailwind CSS 1.0 to-dos. So if you're interested in following along with me as I kind of finish off the last remaining pieces, you can head here. And I just kind of have this public to-do list that I'm keeping up to date. If you want to read more kind of in-depth updates, I have this work journal that I update every week or two where I post kind of like in-depth posts kind of talking about what I worked on with Tailwind, PRs I merged, stuff I struggled on. It's just kind of interesting following the story. And yeah, if you're a fan of Full Stack Radio, my podcast, right now I'm doing this, selling these Full Stack Radio t-shirts. I had these insane death metal shirts designed for the podcast. So for $35, including shipping anywhere in the world, you can get a shirt and a sticker pack, which includes Tailwind CSS stickers. I'm definitely going to lose money on this because of the free shipping thing and all these people from Australia and the UK and Europe ordering shirts, which is fine. I'm just kind of doing it for fun, but it's probably the only time I'll do it. So if you want to grab one of these, you can go to shirts.fullstackradio.com and check that out. But otherwise, that's everything I got. And I'm looking forward to putting together the screencast for you guys tomorrow so you can kind of see us finish off all the little nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, thanks for that, man. That's a great, I really appreciate that. And I know everybody's going to really love that, seeing the rest of that. I mean, when you just brought that up, I was like, he's never going to finish this in an hour. even what you picked there, and you did it. That was amazing. It's just like the power of Tailwind is unbelievable. So cool. I think that's a great way to demonstrate it.
Cool.
One question, you covered pretty much all the questions people asked for the most part, but there was a lot of interest in that Tailwind scale that you had in CodePen, and people want to know if you were going to put that in the docs somewhere at some point or something like that.
Like this one in particular.
You'd have to reshare, but
oh yeah, like the
yeah,
spacing scale with all the squares.
Yeah, that thing.
Yeah, we'll definitely put that in the docs. Right now, like you can just see the values in the docs, which is not ideal. But
Okay, so that's in there already, I guess, but it's just not as visual as that.
Not as visual. Yeah. So I'm gonna make Steve design something really nice for that, and we'll kind of get I want to get a nice visual representations of all the scales in there, so you can sort of see things really nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
All right, everybody. So it's in there. It's just not as beautiful as what.
And even what I showed is ugly, man. Just wait till Steve gets his hands on it.
You guys are like Batman and Robin. I love this back to back. I'll be interested to see what people think. Definitely let us know what you think about this, like kind of two talks that work together like this. But I thought it was really cool to see him go through it and then to see you implement it. It was really interesting.
Yeah, thanks.
Anyway, all right.
Any other questions or anything? Or are we?
Yeah, I mean, there was a bunch of stuff, but you really got the other big one was about the like kind of like best practices for like managing inputs and things like that that go across the whole app, which obviously covered with apply and that. So yeah, so thanks a lot. I will definitely include what you send over, which would be great to have as an extra bonus. And thanks a lot.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, awesome.